Happy Wednesday, Solar Warriors. We are live. Here it is Wednesday. Can you believe it? We're halfway through June. I hope we're more than halfway through the pandemic and the stay-at-home requests and all of the social isolation. I hope that you all are safe and healthy. And I hope that you're jumping in here because you're eager to hear from today's guest, Mr. Jesse Grossman, CEO and founder of SolToJoe. Going to give a quick minute here while folks come online to make sure that we've got an audience. If you are watching this live, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day, the middle of your week. If you have signed up in Crowdcast to watch this as a webinar or a replay, do me a huge favor. In the comments section there, would you just type in live so that we know you're watching it live, and type in replay. That helps us just get a sense of when people are watching and how they're engaging. Who am I? My name is Nico Johnson. If you're seeing this up on your LinkedIn feed or maybe in Periscope and you're not familiar, we have a popular podcast called Suncast where we interview founders and executives of clean tech companies about their personal and professional journey and the corners they are looking around in this energy transition. Most of our interviews over the last 4.5 years, 260 plus interviews, have been in the solar industry, and today is no exception. This is a part of our ongoing series, checking in with industry leaders about how they are transitioning through and looking beyond the, quote, COVID era. Today, we're going to focus on solar project finance and acquisitions with a guy who has quite a bit of experience about this specific topic. As I mentioned before, Jesse Grossman is CEO and founder of SolToJoe. SolToJoe is a developer in the solar industry. Independent renewable power producer is probably a more all-encompassing term, looking at financing and operating distributed utility assets, often getting into, as the industry explodes, battery storage projects. And Jesse's been at this game since 2005. He's directed over $600 million in solar investment assets through SolToJoe and currently owns and manages a portfolio of over 300 megawatts across 14 states. It is my sincere and honest pleasure to welcome Jesse to the show. Jesse, thanks for joining us here on Suncast Live.
Great, Nico, great to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, man, happy Wednesday. I've been, it's interesting for me. I don't know if you've been, I know that you guys actually are participating in some way in the Midwest Solar Expo that Jake and the crew are running on this Verbella platform. Have you had a chance to kind of walk around in that virtual platform yet?
You know, I have not. We got a number of team members that are participating in it. I've been a little busy with a couple other things that I'd be happy to get into, but haven't been able to make it there. But exciting to see all of these shows that we used to love going to in person, now going virtual.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I am personally kind of thrilled to have a face-to-face experience again today. The last 2 days we've been doing this daily show and moderating panels with my avatar inside of this Midwest Solar experience, which itself is quite interesting, but it still is, I mean, it still feels a little different, right? It's an experiment. As you know, many of us are experimenting with business models, with how does our business live through this pandemic era. You and I typically would be doing this sitting at a table at one of the regional conferences, and I'd be catching up with you about all things finance and project acquisition related. So glad that you've taken the time to join us here, and really excited for this conversation. It's one I've been looking forward to, and I'm glad to know that there are folks joining us here on LinkedIn, folks joining us in Periscope and Facebook, and we've got a few folks who've signed up, about 50 or 60 in Crowdcast. So looking forward to this discussion. Hat tip to your friend and mine, Katie Ullman, for helping tee this up and make this conversation a whole lot more interesting. And let's jump into it, Jesse, because I'm really curious to find out a bit more about how SolToJoe, as one of the leading developers in the United States, is seeing the world, like I said, post COVID, as we hope emerges soon. Just a note to all of you who are watching live. Remember, if you use the comment functionality, you can surface your questions to us. In particular on LinkedIn, we can see those comments, acknowledge you, even put your comments up here on screen. So there will be a moment where I'll pop up some questions from the audience as they arise. If you're on Crowdcast, of course, you can ask that question in Crowdcast, and Alex will make sure that it gets surfaced here for Jesse and I to pose in the conversation. Well, Jesse, as we get started here, why don't you tell us a bit about SolToJoe? You know, I've certainly propped you up as one of the leading developers and asset owners. You guys have been around since 2005. What's the world look like for SolToJoe with regard to development, asset ownership, and management?
Yeah. Well, thanks. Good to be here. Great question to start things off. So I'll tell you a little bit about SolToJoe's business and what we do. So we're an experienced, you use the terminology exactly as we do, independent renewable power producer. We were founded in 2005, and we've been doing nothing but, which means we really like owning renewable assets in the clean tech space. So we develop assets, we finance assets, and then we operate distributed utility solar, and now solar plus storage and standalone storage projects in the U.S. We've developed more than 100 solar projects across the U.S. and are currently managing over 300 megawatts across 14 states. So that's a pretty decent portfolio. But as we're only at 4% penetration of solar in the U.S., we think it's a good start. In up markets and down markets, we're going to continue to need renewable energy. And at its core, SolToJoe is a stable, consistent, established development and capital provider to the industry. And we really find ourselves a strong partner to small and medium-sized developers who are also working in this space. We got a long-term track record for success, and we know how to navigate the myriad regulatory, financial, and development risks to get solar assets developed, financed, and over the finish line. In terms of COVID, it's relatively the same strategy, but just continuing with a little bit more sand in the economic gears right now.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, before we jump into kind of how things are moving along present day, which I know a lot of folks are interested to hear, you mentioned a key component here. With hundreds of projects and many megawatts under management, there are a couple of things that I think I'd like to sort of clarify or disintermediate in terms of terminology to make sure that someone who's watching can really understand, am I a good fit for, how this conversation fits for my business? Should I reach out to someone like SolToJoe? You mentioned medium to small-sized developers. I'd like to actually ask sort of a two-part question. What is small to medium from a developer perspective? And then from a market perspective, we've got resi, commercial, C&I, and utility. That spectrum of projects can encompass anything from 2 kilowatts on resi to 200 megawatts and up on utility. Is there a space that you play in there that dictates what small and medium developers look like for you?
Yeah. No, great set of questions to bring up. And this is a poorly defined part of the market. I'll take your easy question first, which is, what do I mean about small and medium-sized developers? Development, and a lot of the developers we work with are found in areas where there's not an active solar market yet. It's folks on the ground that might have done some adjacent development work, maybe in real estate or wind or biomass, that say, solar's taking off here. We're seeing utilities looking for solar. We're seeing landowners that are putting their real estate assets on the market looking for solar development there. And so that could be a 2-person shop, a 10-person shop, a 20-person shop. And that's kind of what I think about when I think of small to medium-sized developers. And they could be doing pure play solar and renewables, or they could be doing, renewables as one part of their development suite, where they're also doing some maybe low-income housing development or some commercial development at the same time. So that's part one of your two-part question. The other point is on, how do we define this sector? And as this market has been growing and evolving very fast, it's been a constant race to try to keep up from a definition and terminology perspective with the speed of innovation on the development side. So I think that's really driven by how creative we've been in this space to try to satisfy the customer demand for solar. So, what I consider the C&I space or the distributed utility space is now more of a exclusive definition than an inclusive definition, and it's a real mashup of a number of things. So you got, the historical definition was residential. I think we all can understand what that is. And then you've got large scale utility, where you're definitely connecting to the transmission lines, multiple 100 megawatts and thousands of acres on a particular asset. What we've seen, driven largely by regulatory state policy, is an expansion of opportunities for the 2 to 20 megawatt developments to happen, largely connected to distribution. We're doing some transmission level voltage connection, but it's largely distribution line connection. And the sales and buy mechanisms for how that power is sold is also pretty varied. You got PERPA markets, you got community solar markets, you got contract for difference and financial swaps that all are included in that distributed utility bucket.
Yeah, and it's also portfolio driven as well. A lot of folks forget that when companies like SolToJoe look at assets, you may not necessarily be talking about a 5 megawatt deal per se on one plot of land. It could be 500 megawatt deals, or excuse me, 5 10 megawatt deals, or 5 100 kilowatt deals. But the portfolio aspect, typically driven by retail customers like the Krogers and Walmarts and Walgreens of the world, have a big impact on and a driver of that sort of middle market. I think it's funny, when I was selling trackers to utilities, I engage a lot with NextEra. NextEra has a whole division dedicated to distributed generation, which for them is anything 20 megawatts and under. And when I started in the game back at the same time you did, 20 megawatts was anything but distributed generation. So I think having that clarification on terminology is important. I know that in a utility space, distributed generation has a completely different focus, and it's more of a question of, is it front of the meter or behind the meter? We're not going to get into all the wonky technical aspects today, but I did want to set the stage because it's important when we talk about developers in this context and we talk about acquiring projects and how finance is being structured or where it's going. It's important to be able to state up front, this is probably a useful conversation for you if you're developing retail locations and portfolios, if you're developing one-off or sort of multi-site regional projects in the 1 to 20 megawatt range, this is going to be a hugely valuable conversation for you. If you're a residential installer thinking about getting into C&I because you've got an exciting market like Illinois, or a community solar market or a MUSH market, this is going to be an interesting conversation for you. SolToJoe is in a unique position here. While a lot of the industry is trying to figure out where to deploy their capital, but also trying to figure out how to engage with their teams, you sort of sit a different place in the market. So I'm curious, how has business changed, if it has, for you since the start of the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah. And it's obviously been a very tough time for the entire country and the entire industry. And I think it's been a real heartening point that, the renewables part of the power sector in particular has continued to move forward as we have. And we certainly, I think, are a bright and shining spot of the economy, pun kind of intended, as we're moving forward. We operate in an industry, in a market where we've got locations for construction and development where social distancing, by and large, can be observed. Solar energy construction has been deemed, with the exception of New York State for a period of time, an essential service. And the local AHJs are all allowing for power development and power construction to continue to move forward. For us at SolToJoe, we've really, for the last decade plus, focused on the capital side of the market as well. And so we've had a lot of dry powder on the investment side. And so we've continued to invest in development, invest with our developers, and be funding projects and bringing assets through construction during this time. When we started this, we had, I think, over 100 megawatts in construction across 5 states, active construction. And so we were actively monitoring all of those assets and making sure they were all continuing to be on a good track moving forward. On the operating asset side, we've got portfolios, and a real question during a time of crisis and a time of pandemic is, how's portfolio performance and portfolio management takes on a particularly special need during a time like this. I've been happy to review with my team that with our electricity counterparties that we sell to, they're predominantly off investment grade off takers. A lot of utilities in there, a lot of municipalities, and a lot of pass-through entities for community solar, which kind of on a shadow credit rating do look investment grade. And that has translated into stable and predictable payments from our customers on the power that we're generating. And they're obviously happy to continue to see some economic benefit and long-term stability from the solar products that they're buying. So that's been positive. I will say, businesses that have a lot of exposure to residential and C&I sectors of the marketplace are probably seeing the biggest impacts right now. And certainly if you're trying to originate new sales in that sector, residential and C&I, they're certainly seeing things slow down when you're not physically able to get to a client's location, or you're not physically, it's not safe to be doing construction work on their facilities when you need to access their property and things of that nature. But pandemics, we've been doing this a long time. We've got, conservative Midwestern roots in terms of how this company was founded. And we know that there's good times and there's bad times, for economic cycles and for market cycles. And so, times like this continue to reinforce how important it is for us as a company and us as an industry to stay disciplined and look to strike appropriate deals that stand on their own 2 legs. And, in good times and bad, transact fairly and appropriately, across the sector.
Yeah, it's an interesting time, right? I'm glad that you brought up the sort of the credit worthiness of municipal counterparties. Counterparty risk is one of the biggest elements of how the transactions can be sort of processed, like run through the finance side of the business. As an owner operator, it's really encouraging to hear that that deals are still making their way through the process. I think one of the biggest concerns in the marketplace, beyond the obvious sort of presumption that residential and C&I were going to get hit, it was a question of whether deal flow would slow down. I think one of the encouraging things is even on the resi side, we're seeing that folks have transitioned quickly to having an online-based sales process and transaction business. Obvious, a lot of social distancing, both from the resi install to the utility O&M side of the business, have quickly been established. I wonder, what were the conversations like among your asset management partners and among the development partners early on? How did you and your team have to engage to really assess the needs to get through this and to set the stage for what might be coming for Q3, Q4?
Yeah, no, good question. And there was a lot of active discussion, both, on the downstream side, with our internal development team and the developer partners we work with, as well as sort of upstream looking at, our own funds and fund management and how we were thinking about investing over the next couple of quarters, as well as reaching out to some of our key partners on the tax equity and debt side. On the development side and pipeline advancement side, really the focus was on what are the risks to continuing to be able to push development forward over the next couple of months. Initially it was weeks, and then stretched into months, and now we're all looking at a new game plan for how we develop going forward. And how do we mitigate any of those risks? And that was a lot of discussions with the permitting agencies, a lot of municipalities, a lot of customers. Really making sure everybody was in the 20th century and able to do video chats for permitting, things of that nature. In terms of equipment, we had to quickly assess whether or not supply chains and shipping routes were going to be impacted. Right. And that had some knock-on effects for ITC safe harboring and timelines under which equipment needed to land on the shores of the U.S., which has subsequently been relaxed by some IRS rulings, which were good to see. But that was an immediate point of focus. And by and large, everybody on the development side was interested in seeing things move ahead as fast as possible. Customers continue to be interested in getting their clean energy, and from development and construction perspective, as assets are moving along, people gets paid, and everybody's looking to continue to have a decent year from a revenue perspective. Upstream on the investment side, it was a number of conversations across a few different points. First, it was very quickly established that capital was going to continue to flow into the space. Very different than 2008 crisis, which precipitated sort of the credit freeze between 2008 and 2010. Financial markets were still wide open, and as the Fed sort of continued to push openness through various fiscal and monetary policies, folks were looking to get capital out. And there was really a flight to quality, and continues to be a flight to quality, of which solar, for not only its stability of revenues and predictable yield and not being correlated to the financial markets, but also for the big ESG investment push which is happening right now. This was an area where 2020 was already going to see and was seeing a wall of money coming, and that didn't really change across, let's say, sponsor equity and debt. We can go into folks are being a little bit more careful with who they're working with and not striking out a lot of new relationships, but that capital is still flowing. Tax equity. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I want to actually touch on that a minute, and we'll circle back around to tax equity. I think you and I both share the idea that partnerships are really important in this industry. As a buyer, someone who is partnering with developers to bring those assets into operation, there are a lot of things that you have to consider, a lot of things that developers have to consider in picking the right partners. So I wanted to take a minute to foray into, we mentioned earlier that you're really focused on small to medium developers. How does a developer best position their assets to find an acquisition partner like SolToJoe?
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right. And we do a lot of partnership with small, medium, and very large developers that are looking to work with us as a long-term buyer and owner of these assets, because they know that, based on the fact that we've been in the marketplace as long as we have, and we've transacted on as many assets as we have, and we actually have a development arm of our own, we know what good looks like, and we know how to make those decisions through the development process. And that's exactly why folks look to partner with us. Positioning is partially about timing and partially about the market that's being accessed. In terms of timing, we always prefer, and I think our partners have found over time this makes a lot of sense, is to start working together earlier rather than later. It's a relatively straightforward statement that if you're building an asset with a 40-year design life, where most of the assumptions are fixed up front, your financial partner is going to have certainly some preferences in terms of how various development challenges are assessed and which risks are taken, which risks are acceptable, which risks are problematic. And those go to sort of big showstopper points that are very easy to either get right or get wrong. And then they get down into a lot of nuances that can really drive additional value from a project and translate right back into the developer's pocket in additional dollars. And so, you can partner with an entity early stage, mid stage, and late stage. We typically think it's most valuable and most useful and most efficient to strike early and mid stage partnerships with developers.
Yeah, given that it is early in the development cycle where the biggest leverage and benefit is found, especially for someone who wants to partner with a company like SolToJoe that has 15 years of experience bringing these projects to fruition. And the fact that we're talking about an infrastructure asset, something that has 30 plus years of life. I'd love to hear if there are any examples that you could bring to the table of a time where you had a partner where you were able to directly influence decisions in that partnership and in the way those project assets were developed, knowing ahead of time that you were going to invest in and bring those assets to the market.
Yeah. And there's a number of examples, Nico, that come to mind. They can range from as simple as advice in terms of talking with a client, where your developer is signing up their site leases across a number of portfolios, and at one point they said, "Well, we got advice that a 20-year lease with 2 5-year extensions at mutual option would be a fine way to go." And we know that now we're financing these assets with a 40-year design life, and having the extra 10-year of lease term is very valuable on the back end, and that's a benefit that we can transition directly to our development partners. So it's very easy conversation to say, well, actually, here's some other, take a quick look at the lease option, make a couple comments, and that really materially impacts the value of the asset. Interconnection is one where we always find a way to add value in terms of how the asset's interconnected, how it's electrically structured. And now, particularly when multiple interconnections are sometimes going in on the same project to add optionality for storage, that's an area where we've invested quite heavily, and an area where a couple tweaks early on can preserve a lot of optionality and value for a project that otherwise could have been lost. And we're happy to step in with developers at later stages. I can think of an example last year where we stepped into a late stage development asset and had to restructure a couple points with the developer to get to a successful close and get the asset up and constructed and invested in, but always easier upfront.
Yeah, one of the things that I've seen over the years is, and this is pretty common even if you think about sports, the idea of pattern recognition is elemental, right? That whole 10,000 hours aspect, it's what can you do in your sleep that a new developer perhaps doesn't know that they don't know. It's one of the things I get approached, having 15 years in the industry, I get approached often by folks saying, hey, can you help me think about how to dispossess this asset or how to grow my portfolio, or what do I need to think about to develop these assets? And in particular, you see this from maybe land guys coming out of real estate or telecom, and they have really fundamental good instincts, but they don't have that 10,000 hours. From a pattern recognition perspective, and the scars that I'm sure you've endured, where do you find that as that big brother to a lot of these transactions, you add discrete value?
Yeah. I think at a macro level, it's the confidence that if we sign into a project or a portfolio or a strategy, we've got the know-how and the capital and the track record of getting things to the finish line. And development is a bit of a murky process at times. We like to say internally, all good deals have 3 near-death experiences before they get there. And we've lived that. And so that's I think the confidence that we have about knowing what good ultimately looks like and how to get assets there is the biggest and best benefit that we can give partners. And really, it's the fact that we're aware of the 100 different points that you've got to get right in development that allow for us to have that confidence and that in the marketplace.
Yeah, I'm sure you have hundreds of stories, and you've told them all over wine and cocktails. But I wonder, through the many different ways that you've helped developers, if you've come to a conclusion about the right time to structure a deal in the portfolio development cycle. I find that this is one of those uncertainties that's particular to solar that doesn't necessarily translate from other kinds of development. And I'd love to hear your expert opinion on that.
Yeah. And this is this is hard, because development is as much an art as a science. And if it was easy, everybody would be doing it, and everybody would be cashing out big from one development play in one market, as opposed to really being focused on hitting singles and doubles consistently over the years. But in terms of timing, I like to simplify development to a 10-step process. And one side say the first 3 big points or 4 big points are at least proven out from a business plan perspective. They don't have to be in place, and they don't all have to be fully funded, but they need to be somewhat, internally articulated, understood, and then a story around them is a good place to engage with a group like SolToJoe. Although we're happy to start having conversations much earlier. And a couple of the fundamental things that are there are, you got to have a development thesis in the market. It's to say, if I think that if I go through these 10 steps, I will come out the other side and have a valuable solar project, which is ready for institutional investment. And then sort of driving right below that, it's about site control, it's about interconnection, it's about an idea of where revenue is going to come from through PPA or contract for differences or financial swap. And it's about really having some fundamental understanding of the permitting pathway. And am I going to be able, in this region, to get through permitting? And I feel once there's a fair story around those 4 points, is a really good time to talk with an entity like SolToJoe that is interested in engaging. And mind you, once that idea is in place, you're still 8 to 24 months out from being able to build an asset. But I think that's, in my opinion, the sweet spot for when to start engaging with a development, with a capital partner like SolToJoe.
Yeah, I've heard so many folks trying to get into the game who their intent is to have an annuity, and they want to own that asset, only to find, as you mentioned, that there are 3 minimum near-death experiences, and you really have to have the capital partner behind you or the own internal stability to endure what we proverbially call the solar coaster. And I see so many folks holding out to try and sell later to juice that return on the transaction, when frankly, if they'd engaged a SolToJoe in their process, not only would they sell more efficiently, but they would be able to just simply process more transactions. The templates, the access to capital, the efficiency that a partner like SolToJoe can bring to the table, it really gives it's like adding racing fuel instead of 87 octane to an otherwise stable vehicle. I wonder, Jesse, does an economic downturn impact project development and project finance? How do recessions change the outlook for things like tax equity? I mean, we're coming off of the best bull market that you and I have personally experienced, and we both went through the 2008 recession. What should folks be really thinking about or considering from a development perspective with regards to market outlook, recession, proofing their business, and even things like tax equity?
Yeah. No, I mean, right. Good, very good point. I think right now is the time to, batten the hatches and strap down everything you have, because the economic indicators are such that it's going to be rocky for a couple years. I think 7 years is historically the amount of time for positive markets before there's some correction. We were 12, 13 years in. So I don't think this is anything, more than something was going to come along cyclically to change the party for a period of time.
Right.
I think the fundamentals of infrastructure investment and electricity provision are not changing. In fact, the drivers are positive. And so I think from a macro perspective, there will continue to be really good non-disintermediatable and non-outsourceable opportunities for good development and investment in the U.S., but there is going to be just a whole lot more sand in the economic gearbox for the next couple of years. And that's going to trickle down. Specifically to your question, there was a lot of development loans that were available. And that the advent of that, really took off around 4 or 5 years ago. And that's about as risky capital as you can put into the place, into the market. Shops were putting down money for developers to put interconnection agreements in, sign lease options, things like that. I suspect a lot of that will dry up as folks dial back risk tolerances and preferences, and there's less liquidity in the system. Sponsor equity is a big component, and there are a lot of pension funds, insurance companies, corporates, etc. Those that still have solid economic footing are going to continue to be shifting their investment into this space. And so I think that's a real positive, and they're going to be looking for market rates of return. And, as treasuries are down near zero, the yields that you can get off of solar investments continue to look very attractive. Tax equity, and I'm glad you brought that up, but that's, getting phased down. We're in the 26% environment. Next, it'll drop down for the next couple of years before it goes down to its 10% baseline, absent any corrective policies. That's an area where we're seeing pullback from medium and even some larger players that were associated with the insurance space. Insurance companies going to get hit pretty hard, and any of the C&I corporates that have a lot of exposure to the retail sector. Those groups are either taking a pause as they're not sure what their 2020 profit levels are going to be, or saying they're exiting the market for a period of time. I think all of this gets back to one of the points we were making earlier around partnership. We were coming at it from a how do you de-risk development aspect. But I think on the other side is how do you ensure that there is a stable investor who's on the other side of the project that you're building, such that when you're ready for construction, that there's a seamless home for that, and you're not going to be out shopping that in a potentially adverse marketplace.
Yeah, I think that's so key, and we've both seen it over the years. Folks who seem cavalier about the solidity, if you will, of their development portfolio, only to find themselves in essentially a fire sale because the dynamic changes in the market by the time they finally get that last interconnection or right of way for their project. Yeah. I mean, I wish I had a dollar for every time someone's called me and said the economic situation has changed and we need some recommendations for buyers. We talked a bit about, we've both been in the industry for a while, and one of the things that I admire about the work that you guys have accomplished is that you're not a Johnny-come-lately to the market. You established this company 15 years ago and endured what till now has been the greatest economic recession or downturn of our lives. Are there any takeaways that might inform your approach to getting through this recession that you might look back from 10 years ago and say, well, here are things that we need to not forget if hindsight truly is 2020?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and to one of your earlier points about development hubris, this market just disincents that pretty regularly, and I tell the team all the time, and we wake up every morning being very humble because you never know what's going to happen. And I think humility is really an important part of success and long-term success in this industry, and making sure you're looking at the downside as well as the potential upside. And that's been kind of our motto from T0. I think it's one of the reasons why we've survived and thrived as long as we have. 2008 and 2010, 2011, I hope we're not going to see anything like that again, because that was a crisis that had its roots in the financial markets, and they were just done. So it'd be a very different conversation 16 weeks into that crisis, as opposed to one which has its roots in a biological nature and something which we need to understand and avoid and treat, as opposed to some internal systemic financial issues. For us, in 2008, we were doing a large capital raise. And we'd started that in 2007 to take on a significant minority partner for SolToJoe. And we had found that partner right before the crisis hit. And, sometimes better to be lucky than plan things perfectly. But ended up, we ended up taking a large energy company as a minority partner, a group out of Omaha, Nebraska called Tenaska Energy, and just great partner. And we took that partnership at the right time, and those resources allowed for us to weather 2009, 2010, continue to execute, and then we were ready to be a stronger, more seasoned business in 2011 as the capital markets started opening up again. And so that's something which I've reflected on relatively frequently during the last 3-4 months here. And so thanks for bringing that up. That was something enjoyable to reflect back on.
Indeed, and for those who perhaps are unfamiliar, I mean, you may as well be saying that you took an investment from Berkshire and Buffett himself in the recession, because Tenaska is just one of those Omaha-based companies that has been around forever, and to have them invest in your company tells me two things. One, you had a really sound business proposition, and two, you are not of the ilk who, despite having been around for barely 3 years, would sit back and say, we're good, we've got enough capital, I don't really want to dilute my company. I've heard over and over again, sort of reviewing the last economic cycle to try and get insights into how folks can be responding now, is especially in this environment, you have to always be thinking about your capital position and raising more money sooner than you thought you would. I've talked to, unfortunately, a number of startups in our business who were just ready. They thought, at least maybe in January, February, ready to close that Series A, and now their investment partners have gone cold and they're running out of capital, and their portfolios are sitting stagnant because they don't have the capital to invest in production or in interconnection queue fees, etc. But that it raises the point, not only that we do anticipate the markets will go back up and the economy will improve, because this isn't fundamentally rooted in a financial market crisis. Folks have to position themselves well. But we also come from deep roots in the solar industry. Some have referred to them as sort of hippie-esque, which is firmly rooted in community. And one of the things that I love about our industry is sooner or later, you never say never to a partnership opportunity, because sooner or later you do end up finding opportunities to work with other developers, other financiers. So much moving around in this industry happens that you just can't afford to burn bridges, frankly. I'd love to hear from your perspective as an industry veteran. How can developers in this moment in time work together to get through this pandemic?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the largest areas of continuous focus needs to be on opening up state markets, and that really happens. As we know, we've got one country and 50 different markets, and then there's sub-markets within those jurisdictions. And so we really look at, our business model. We're 100% domestic focused, and we're continuing to just be domestic focused. But with 50 state markets, we've got more than enough opportunities. But there's a number of markets which, are still very cold from a solar perspective and have not opened up. And to the extent that developers can continue to band together and push state markets, because locals have the influence. Everything in this space and the game of development really is a local play. So I think developers continuing to work at local levels to ensure the continuity of their markets is one of the strongest areas where folks can be working together and continuing to achieve meaningful impacts. We need to see 3, 4, 5 new markets open in 2021 and 2022 to continue to support the pace of development that this country needs and meet the needs of the customers. And that's an area where everybody can have a daily impact.
Yeah, where if you'd be so bold as to pull back the curtain a bit, what are some of the markets that you're most interested in?
Yeah. Well, this is a market that's folks have been looking at for 12 months or so, but Maine has been an interesting one as a new state where folks have been developing into. Virginia's passed some pretty interesting facultative regulations for new solar development, not on the utility scale side that was seen over the last 3 or 4 years, but on the more community solar side, 2 to 5 megawatt side, similar to what we've seen in other Southeast markets. I'm hearing some interesting rumblings on Arizona and Nevada, finally putting some meat onto the bones of their market for distributed utility assets. And then some of the other Midwest states really do need to pick up the ball. We saw really a lot of movement in Illinois, but ultimately it was a conscripted program that only let a certain amount of solar projects through. They only had funding for a couple hundred megawatts. We need to see another program enabled there. And then, but other states, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, have all been looking at what Illinois did, the benefits that were brought to the ratepayers, and the construction jobs that were added. And there's a lot of conversations about how that gets replicated. These programs and program development is a multi-year effort on the grassroots, and it's important. Every state in the U.S. at this point can and should have a viable, long-term, replicable, sustainable solar program, and we'll get there over the next decade.
Yeah, man, fantastic. Jesse, before we step away, I just wanted to mention Amanda Tsushima over on one of the other platforms is asking something that I know a lot of our listeners and watchers are thinking. Would love to hear Jesse share those 10 steps. Amanda, I think I'm gonna take you up on that. I may pull Jesse into another private conversation. We'll see if we can put that into something that looks like a guide for you all, for developers, and also some additional content to think about how the development game can be won. Certainly gleaning insights from an industry veteran like Jesse and his team at SolToJoe are at the top of our list here at SunTech, or excuse me, I keep saying SunTech. I don't know why I have that on my brain today, at Suncast. So thankful for all the solar warriors tuning in on the various channels today. This has been a conversation not only about solar finance and tax equity and post-COVID environment, but looking into the leadership that industry veterans like Jesse are bringing in to the industry as we work through a very challenging and difficult time, but one that for us brings hope and optimism. Jesse, as I mentioned, is the CEO of SolToJoe, an independent renewable power producer developing financing and operating distributed utility solar and solar plus battery systems across the United States. I'd highlight that if you want to connect with either Jesse or I, we're both obviously active on LinkedIn. I'd encourage you to reach out with him there, as well as his team. They are first class in not only addressing your needs as a developer, but in connecting and creating those partnerships that Jesse mentioned. Jesse, any parting thoughts from you?
Let's we have a lot of work to do, team, and across the industry. I mentioned in my opening statement we're at 4% penetration in the U.S. right now, and it's going to be a very interesting set of conversations, Nika, which I hope we'll be able to continue to have as we get to 10% penetration, 20% penetration, and 50% penetration, and we'll all be enjoying our work and making the world a better place as we do it. So thanks a lot for having me on, and appreciate everybody that listened in.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And as we always say, you are what you listen to, Solar Warriors. Thanks for tuning in, and join us again on the next Suncast Live here on LinkedIn, Facebook, wherever it is that you've joined in. We're grateful for your time, grateful for yours as well, Jesse, and thank you all. We'll be tuning back in very soon. Stay tuned.